that document, and his lovely wife, Dolley Madison, who has really helped define the role of President's wife and First Lady. And of course, we would be remiss on this President's Day if we did not include a very famous First Lady whose power and prestige lasted many years after the death of her husband, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was First Lady from 1933 to 1945, and we're happy to hear from all of them. I'm actually going to stand amongst you, since I'm one of you. And I may start with the first question, but I'd love to have you ask additional questions. So this is for each of the panelists, and you're welcome to ask them individually or ask them as a group. And my first question would be, when you were a child, did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Oh, I thank you for the question. First, I should say, greetings, ladies, gentlemen. I should say I was a child of this revolution, raised and reared in our ancient regime. Sitting as subject of His Majesty King George III, I was raised in the most obscure corner of the globe imaginable, far away from this metropolis of Boston, 135 miles from the capital of Virginia, Orange County, Virginia. Indeed, from my doorstep, a third of a mile away, were the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And amongst this quiet solitude I was raised both by my father and my mother, paternal and maternal, to cultivate the soil, the cultivation of tobacco. Now, from that, being born of a privileged, wealthy planter, I was promised all the fortune his wealth could provide. At the age of 11, I received an education, learned 5 of my 7 languages from a Scotsman, which is why I speak them with a terrible Scottish accent. And then from that went on to the College of New Jersey at Princeton, completing what would have been 5 years of study in 3 years. Now here gets to the dilemma. Being uncertain of what to do after college, I moved back in with my parents. I spent the remaining years there in a miserable state of health. I contemplated becoming a schoolmaster. I contemplated the life of a clergyman. I contemplated the life of a lawyer, but my Dolley will tell you, being very poor in public speaking, I ruled that out. But the one thing I was certain of is that I would never go into politics. And yes, I suspect the one thing that I adhered to in my youth and continued was a great love of study. Do you all enjoy to read? It is the most essential pastime, the enlightenment of your mind. Knowing full well, knowledge is the only thing that will govern ignorance. I'm pleased to see Mr. Adams and myself agree upon it.
Yes, as we perhaps did not agree during my administration, but that is beside the point.
There is a first for everything.
Leaving politics behind for this moment, it is odd to hear something very similar in contemplating professions, because as I have told the story perhaps too many times, I told Father that I had no interest in books, that I wished to be a farmer, and he cured me of that, although I still think of myself as a farmer, especially in retirement. Father wished me to be a minister. Can you imagine a man such as myself as a minister on the pulpit on Sundays?
I'm trying.
Indeed.
And church lasts long enough without him there.
Indeed. And of course, Mrs. Adams' father was a minister, and I saw that perhaps I was not suited to that role, and I had to disappoint Father. And at Harvard College, I was informed by classmates during debate that I had a gift for speaking well, and as the gentleman in Congress would eventually find out, perhaps sometimes far too long. And so I did indeed decide after some time to become a lawyer. And I went to read law out with James Putnam in Worcester. But during the time that I was studying to be a lawyer, I was actually a teacher for a short amount of time. The one great accomplishment of being a teacher I had was observing my students and their behavior. So perhaps it was best that I followed the law and then into government.
Mrs. Adams?
Well, I should say I did not necessarily have my mind set on a particular trade or area of study. Of course, my upbringing in the 1740s and 1750s in Weymouth was not quite as exposed to extensive education for young ladies, though I was taught by my good father, as he mentioned, a good reverend,
Indeed.
and my attentive mother, my letters, and I did quite establish a deep, deep, deep love for literature, for poetry, for novels, books. I love to read plays, and when we had our chance to be in Europe, where the theater scene is much more extensive, I very dearly love to watch dramas. Of course, thinking of my own future as a young girl, I did not see myself in any great place of eminence. Weymouth, Massachusetts is, as is today, quite a small place, a little bit sleepy. But I knew that for my entire life, I've had this philosophy that the primary duty of all mankind, in a few words, is to be good and to do good. And so to apply myself to my studies and to my family, to be able to work hard to sustain the household, to raise my children, to support my husband, and to offer my counsel and advice. I am not a silent follower, I should say. But by offering myself my own gifts and the blessings I've been given in this life, I should hope that I have served my country and my Commonwealth of Massachusetts with as much vigor as I possibly could.
And Mrs. Madison, as a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Indeed, as a child. Well, I had a very fond childhood. I grew with many brothers and sisters. We were all of the time imagining all sorts of things, the largest imaginings that you could imagine. We were making up, running wild through the wilds of Virginia. I grew with many cousins, and I was born into a family a Quaker family, that being a religion, also called the Society of Friends. And in this particular meeting, religious meeting house, one, as a woman, could preach. One could be a clerk of the ladies' meeting houses. And my mother was a clerk and an elder. And I grew with the idea that perhaps I could do just about anything I set my mind to. And I didn't really think on anything in particular, but I thought that as I grew, I could be whatever I chose to be. And I think now, looking back on my life, I am doing exactly what I ought to be doing. I am consistently able to connect with people and to talk with people and make other people connect and introduce enemies and friends and make them all friends alike. And anything within my imagination's reach, I find that I might as well do it if I can.
You
Thank
are
you very
incredibly
much.
well suited for your
Indeed.
station.
Oh,
madam.
thank you. Some would say not so, but I appreciate your support.
And Mrs. Roosevelt?
Well, I admire Mrs. Madison's bravery, because I did not have that bravery as a child. If you're asking what we thought when we were young, I felt quite useless and afraid as a child. My mother died when I was 8, and my father shortly before I turned 10. And I didn't really have any confidence at all. You have the same confidence of my uncle, Theodore Roosevelt. He was very outgoing and friendly, and he had the kindness to call me his favorite niece. I think I was his only niece, but that he still let me be his favorite. But I was, and because I felt that everyone looked down upon my looks, and that's what I was supposed to have that was good, it was, I found finally, what you found as well, I think, both of you, is that, well, I remember when my Aunt Pussy, that's her nickname, but that's what we called her, when she had a sore throat, and she asked me to go down to the basement to get her some ice. I was terrified at the dark. I must have been maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old. And I was very scared. There were spider webs down there and creaky noises, but that's where you had to go to get ice. And normally I would never go there for myself. Oh, but if I could do something for my aunt and be useful, if I could do a kindness, that's what got me to overcome my fear. And I think we must try to do the thing that we think we cannot do, because it's when we do, that's when we are able to expand our world a little bit bigger, especially if we can do something to help other people. I, too, enjoy making bridges between people whenever possible, because I think it's only in getting to know one another that we're no longer enemies.
All right,
Bravo.
Thank you all so much. So now I'm going to take questions. Questions. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Questions. Any questions?
Oh, that Congress would be this easy.
There's a
There
question.
we go.
That's you, my dear.
What are the languages that you speak?
Oh, I thank you for the question. The languages I speak are customary for this enlightened age to have access to the various volumes of human history. They are, of course, the Romance languages, to wit, Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish. To that end, equally, I count the English language, for the better or worse, some mastery of. The Greek language, ancient to be specific, and the last language which I learned in 1772, my last year at Princeton, was Hebrew. Now, the reason why I learned Hebrew is unique, particular, peculiar. You see, I did not wish to find any source that would come between me and what I conceived to be the truth. You see, in this age, we have not the access of translation, and for a great many, for those, for instance, who cannot read, must rely upon those to tell them what it means. I have ever been one who has quested for the truth as it falls to my own conscience. Now, I will say my aptitude in speaking foreign languages is very poor. But from that, when the time came to take the notes for our Federal Constitutional Convention, I kept a shorthand of all the various languages I speak, and whichever word was shortest in those 7 languages was the word that I used, which will make it very laborious to translate.
Indeed.
I'll take another question.
This question is from Mrs. Roosevelt. Mrs. Roosevelt, did you enjoy reading as a little girl, and what did you read?
Did I enjoy reading as a little girl? Absolutely. I did spend a good bit of time alone as a child, but my grandfather had quite a library, and he was very interested in theology, and I wasn't so interested in the theology books, but he had books on geography and various novels, various books of fiction, but that took you around the world. If I could submit myself to a book, why the world around me would disappear. I have many, many hours, happy hours reading.
All right, I'll take another question. Another question, yes.
This is for the First Ladies. At the time, did you feel that there were some specific expectations as to the jobs that you were supposed to take on as you came into politics, as there are expectations now?
Well, taking up the mantle from Mrs. Washington was some very small but very important footsteps to follow in. Just very small. That was a joke.
Indeed.
Mrs. Washington had such a privileged upbringing as a young woman, and then through her first marriage and through her marriage to Mr. Washington, the first president. She had so many luxuries of property and wealth, many people to come visit her, and she was able to establish quite a gentlewoman's persona. And she had great grace to carry that through. I much enjoyed my company with her every time I met her. Though, of course, she was incredibly busy, and she had to do that straddling the divides of making sure everyone in the room felt seen and felt appreciated, which, of course, in order to do so for everyone in the room, you have to be able to detach yourself from any individual quite quickly. Personally, I make better friends when I am able to have a lengthy conversation with someone. Some of you may have heard I mentioned it earlier this morning, but it took a few years for John to start liking me, in fact. Now, of course, there was only that one precedent to follow in, but rather important. One of the most difficult things for me, transitioning from the wife of the vice president to the wife of the president, was the greater expectation that I should be living at the seat of government. During the second term of John's vice presidency, I spent the vast majority of the time in Massachusetts. Now, largely this had to do with illness, but I really don't like being away from home. Living in the president's house, which was at the time we inhabited it, quite a
Indeed.
work in progress. Dreary, drafty, cold, unpleasant, and we hadn't the vast wealth of Virginian planters in order to furnish it.
We did not. We used everything that we had in that house.
Yes, we did. So leaving my home and being a symbol of hospitality and a symbol of the nation, of the women of the nation, it did require me to sacrifice quite a lot, and that was a difficult part of our 4 years in the presidency. What do you say, Mrs. Madison?
Indeed, I followed, of course, Mrs. Adams here. Mr. Jefferson, the president before my dear husband, had no wife. And on occasion I helped to host as needed at the presidential mansion. Though I shared that responsibility with other ladies, and he was not in the habit of inviting ladies to his home if he could help it, so I was not always required. You can speak with him on the matter someday. In any case, I followed in the steps of two marvelous ladies who set an example for what these new Republican ideals ought to look like, embodied in a lady of such stature, position. And I moved into the position, however, knowing that it's still new, and that perhaps I could make some changes and make it my own. Nothing too large, of course, small things, like I believe that Mrs. Adams and Mrs. Washington preferred to greet guests in their home in a more formal manner, allowing people to come to them and allowing the room to sort of function in a more formal scenario, whereas perhaps much to his chagrin, he is not one to like social situations. I was always on the move, and that is why I wear the plumes, so that he can find me in a crowd. So in small ways, I found opportunities to make the position my own. You spoke of the home that you were living in, and it was very, very unfinished at the time. Though I never spent time with you there, I did see it in the state that you inhabited. I heard, you may correct me on the matter, but I heard that you hung your laundry in the Oval Room.
Yes.
I later refurnished that room, so perhaps you
That's a wise move, really, the best thing you could possibly do.
And so I spent some money making the home itself reflect those new Republican ideals as well.
And you had so much time of American history pass before you had the opportunity to be First Lady. Mrs.
I remember when I was riding to the inauguration, and I asked Mrs. Hoover what she would most miss about the White House. And she said something about having other people plan the meals for her. And that seemed to me something I think I was hoping for something more from her. But I did break a number of traditions. I had a press conference right off the start, and no First Lady had ever held a press conference before. I insisted that you must understand the employment was so low, and that I felt women journalists deserved employment as well. So I said, only women journalists may come to my press conferences. And this ended up being quite a scoop, because as you recall, that's the election in 1932, with the inauguration in March of 1933. That's when Prohibition was repealed. And so there was a great deal of curiosity about whether or not any alcoholic beverages would be served at the White House. Well, someone asked me in passing at one point, and I referred them to Franklin, but Franklin, with a twinkle in his eye, he told them, well, you'll have to ask my wife at her press conference. So all the men that were making fun of the women said that, oh, you're just going to talk about what color hat she's wearing, or what her outfit is, or what's being served that evening at dinner. They were all hovering outside the room to find out the scoop. And I was able to break it to the women there that, yes, indeed, some libations would be served. But this turned out to be very important for the women journalists, that they were allowed, and over time I was allowed to express my opinion on various issues. I am still a citizen of the United States, even if I am First Lady, and I am allowed to hold opinions of my own. With my Day article that began in the newspapers in 1936, I had been writing long letters to Lorena Hickok, and she said, oh, you should publish these in the paper and let the world see what you're up to. At first, I just talked about who came for dinner, which ambassadors or which people maybe a clever thing they had said. But over time, I found that I could express my opinion there. And even now that I'm no longer First Lady at the White House, I still keep my Day article going. I can sometimes raise an issue that I think it's worth many of us speaking about.
Okay, I'll take another question for one or many. One more question over here.
This question is for the president. What was your vision for the country?
Very good question. Very astute question. I should say first and foremost, as Mr. Adams came before, I should defer to you first, sir.
Indeed. Well, I did have a vision when I took office. The first, and this will be a little bit of a joke, vision that I had was standing there on my inauguration day and being invited to enter the room, introduced, and being decisively shorter than my predecessor and my vice president. Of course, as you know, my vice president finished second in the election, and that was the way it was done then. My vision was, when I took office, and I told you this many times, that I wished all of us to work together. There was a divisiveness of parties. There were the Federalists, President Washington's faction, led by Mr. Hamilton, the little man from New York that I mentioned this morning. And, of course, there was Mr. Jefferson's faction, including yourself, Mr. Madison, and Mr. Monroe. It was my hope that when I took office, that I would be able to avoid a war with France by bringing together a bipartisan government. I extended an olive branch to Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison to be my envoy to resolve our differences with France with their vast experiences in that country, most especially with Mr. Jefferson, who had been there for a great deal of time. And it was not taken up. And not only did I find that I had enemies in that faction, but I had enemies in, dare I say, my own faction, led by Mr. Hamilton. In the end, I wish to keep us out of wars with European countries, as my predecessor, President Washington, had done. I wish to work at a government that worked together. And I wished also that we would find our way as a country, and that I would have a second term, although I must say that returning home was nice indeed. But just a vision of a country devoid of parties, devoid of bickering, and unfortunately, all of that came upon us. And of course, there are some regrets. The Alien and Sedition Acts, I regret very much. But for a unified government without parties was my hope, and it was not to be the case, and would prove to be my undoing.
I should speak of political theorem and political philosophy, but you ask specifically a vision for America. I espoused in my youth various political ideas, political hopes. In some, I wished to grow old in a free country. From the first moment I was capable of contemplating political ideas, I have never ceased wishing success to a well-regulated Republican experiment of government. My hope for it is that it stands an example to the world, a union that can be perpetuated, a revolution that need not spill a drop of blood so long as there is ink. Now, over the course of that, we have witnessed faction arise in this nation. To my estimation, faction will ever be an inevitability. So long as man has a commonality of ideas, finds things in common with their fellow man, they will band together to endeavor to check another faction. Such a thing is inevitable. And yet, the people of America, knit together as they are by so many cords of affection, can always be members of the same family. Would you know, my dear, that history dictates that such democratic experiments of government always fail? They're short in their lives. They're volatile in their deaths. This is what has justified kings, princes, and states to say that people cannot govern themselves. My vision for America is to prove history wrong. It always has been.
Indeed.
Well, unfortunately, our time is it's actually running out. So I want to have everyone give a hand to our speakers. Thank you so much for your excellent questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Shall we, my dear?
Yes, indeed.
Apparently, I have not gotten over the election.
I don't think you ever will, John.
It does, doesn't it?
Is that my microphone that's...
I'm not sure. I think my mic was picking up some breath.